Chicago, Illinois, 1929, St. Valentine's Day. It was a day of love everywhere except a garage on the city's north side. In that garage, 7 people were killed in what has gone down in history as Al Capone versus Bugs Moran. But is that the truth? Was Al Capone really behind the St. Valentine's Day massacre? And was Bugs Moran the target? And how did it change Chicago's underworld forever? It's the History of Murder, and I'm your host, Clare O'Donoghue. On February 14, 1929, at 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up in front of SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street. According to witnesses, 2 policemen got out of the car and went inside the garage. The car was typical of what the Chicago police used, and the place was whispered to be a spot where illegal liquor was stored and distributed, so no one thought much of it. Just a raid. That's what the people on Clark Street thought. But not this time. This time would change everything. For Paul Durica, director of exhibitions at the Chicago History Museum, it was understandable that the neighborhood didn't pay much attention to the men walking into the garage.
Clark Street, just like it is today, it was like a busy street, a mix of residential properties and commercial properties, a lot of activity early on a Thursday morning. And so people heard what sounded like gunshots, but they weren't quite sure what had happened.
Neighbors saw the 2 policemen come out of the garage with the 2 other men dressed in suits, their hands up, in what seemed like an arrest. All 4 got into the car and drove away.
But then, after things had quieted down a bit and the activity had ended, what people began to hear was the dog howling. And it was really kind of like Highball's howling that kind of drew attention.
Highball, a German shepherd, was unrelenting. His howls from inside the garage alarmed the neighbors, and they called the police. When detectives arrived, there were 7 men inside the garage. They had all been shot. One was leaning against a chair. The rest were laying on the floor near a brick wall.
At first, they think all 7 are dead, but it turns out that one of the bodies is still moving, and there's a gentleman very, very slowly trying to kind of crawl towards the door.
His name was Frank Gusenberg, a 35-year-old bootlegger who worked for the North Side Gang. One of the cops on the scene knew him and asked, "Who shot you?" His reply?
"Nobody shot me."
He had 14 bullet holes.
He refuses to talk or to name names, as it were, and then he dies. And then, the real mystery sets in.
The other men in the garage were an odd collection. Most were members of the North Side Gang. Peter Gusenberg, Frank's older brother, and like Frank, an enforcer. Albert Ketchelek, a.k.a. James Clark, second in command of the gang. Adam Heyer, the gang's business manager, and Albert Weincheck, a high-level member. But there was also a mechanic, John May, and an optician, Reinhard Schwimmer. The one person police may have expected to find, but didn't, was the leader of the gang, George Bugs Moran. The first questions were, where was he? And why kill his gang, but not him?
Before we continue, please remember to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. It will help us continue to make new content. Now, back to the story.
The 1920s had been a time of transition from the awful reality of World War I and a global pandemic to a boom time. Store credit cards were introduced and buying stocks on margin became wildly popular. Interest-only mortgages made it seem possible for people to live a life well beyond their means. Radios were almost non-existent at the beginning of the decade, but by the end, the majority of Americans were enjoying this new form of mass media. Similarly, car ownership had started the 1920s as a luxury, but by 1929, 60% of U.S. households owned a car. It made it easier to see family, travel, or speed away from a crime scene, which came in handy because of another change in American life in the 1920s. In 1917, Prohibition had passed the Senate with only 13 hours of debate. It took a day for the House to agree. And by January of 1919, 46 of the 48 states had ratified it, making it a constitutional amendment. Only Rhode Island and Connecticut would not join in. Prohibition outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. It did not outlaw drinking. The Volstead Act was then passed to create enforcement of the new law with the expectation that, despite the loophole, as of January 17, 1920, America would go dry. But what it really did was turn a significant portion of Americans into criminals.
People in every walk of life violated the Volstead Act almost on a daily basis. So you had hundreds, if not thousands, of Chicagoans who would brew beer or make wine or even distill spirits in their own homes, in their apartments, speakeasies, but there was also something known as beer flats. People just brew beer in their apartments. And then if they decided not just to drink what they produced on their own, but actually share it with their neighbors, or critically perhaps sell it to their neighbors, then it begins to slide into being a criminal enterprise. Far more of those operations existed in the city than the ones that were being run by large gangs that Al Capone eventually took over.
Because Prohibition had made criminal activity mainstream, there was more tolerance for gangsters who were simply operating at a larger scale, even as they got involved in increasingly deadly behavior. There were an estimated 500 gang killings in Chicago during the 1920s. Until 1929, the most famous were Dean O'Banion at his flower shop and Jaime Weiss near Holy Name Cathedral. Those killings and that of a third man, Vincent Drucci, left George Bugs Moran in charge of the North Side Gang. 35-year-old George Moran was an odd choice for the leader of a criminal gang in Chicago. For starters, his name wasn't George Moran, and he wasn't from Chicago. His name was Adelard Coonan. He was from St. Paul, Minnesota, the son of a French immigrant. He had been arrested multiple times by the time he turned 21. At one arrest, the story goes, when he was asked his name, he gave the name of an acquaintance, George Moran. The name stuck. The nickname, Bugs, came because of his hot temper and unstable personality. He hated it. But he liked being in charge of a very successful gang, which had an estimated earnings of over $1 million a week in today's money. He lived in a high-end hotel in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, not far from the garage where the killings would happen. He had gotten married in 1921 and adopted his wife's 1-year-old son, changing the boy's name to John George Moran. It was said he loved being a family man, but apparently he hated Al Capone more. He blamed the leader of the South Side Gang for the deaths of O'Banion and Weiss, and he wanted him dead. He didn't give long press interviews, but he did make time to insult Capone whenever there was a reporter around.
Capone always has guards. Me, I travel around with a couple of pals. He can't sleep nice. If you ask me, he's on dope. Me, I don't even need an aspirin.
For his part, Capone was no fan of Moran's. 30 years old, married with a son of his own, Capone took over his gang when his boss, Johnny Torrio, retired after recovering from a near-fatal shooting. While Moran was known for being cocky, maybe a little crazy, Capone could be charming. He had been a poor kid in Brooklyn and had worked his way up doing various jobs, from candy store clerk to bowling alley pinboy. But those were his legitimate jobs. By night, he was a bouncer at a local brothel. He got the name Scarface when he flirted with the sister of a gang member in Brooklyn. The overprotective brother cut his face. He did not like the nickname and hid the scar from photos whenever he could. As he got older, moved to Chicago, and became a successful bootlegger, he preferred another nickname.
Snorky was the nickname that those who knew him well would use.
Snorky was a term for a sharp dresser,
Capone also liked to live lavishly. This was expressed in the way he dressed. It was expressed in the jewelry he had. It was expressed in his presence at public events. So at the racetrack or at baseball games. So he becomes a sort of personality in the city. And it all happens very quickly. I think it's largely through his self-presentation that he has the reputation that he does today.
That presentation may have had a purpose beyond just showing off.
But he, there was kind of, I don't want to call it a genius, but certainly a kind of, there certainly was an amount of cunning involved in what he did. Because on one hand, being out in the public might suggest that he has a tremendous ego, right? And he just wants to be accepted by a respectable society and wants to be seen as a success in the U.S. On the other hand, by being so public and by creating this kind of amiable presence, he's meeting a need that people have and he's supplying them with something that they want, beer and alcoholic beverages. He's able to produce a kind of goodwill, or almost present himself as a sort of folk figure, standing in defiance of what is becoming an increasingly more unpopular law.
Capone winked at his reputation as a dangerous bootlegger.
I give the public what it wants. I never had to send out high-pressure salesmen. I could never meet the demand.
His personality made him seem, I guess the word is, untouchable.
In a way, yes, it does make him feel untouchable. Because if anyone is going to arrest Capone, it's going to be a very kind of public incident, and it'll be largely reported on. And of course, they'll have to have some pretty solid evidence. He's brought in and questioned and investigated in multiple ways over the years, but nothing really ever sticks. And I think his kind of public presence kind of helps to sort of insulate him from a lot of scrutiny and from having to kind of face the consequences of his actions.
Capone seemed to understand the delicate balance between his public persona and his private dealings.
You can get much further with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone.
For several years, Capone and Moran scuffled. There were shootings, arrests, bribing different politicians, even attempts at a truce, though that didn't last. Chicagoans didn't blame the gangsters for the rising level of violence. They blamed the increasingly unpopular Prohibition. Even Irish-born Chicago Police Commissioner William Russell agreed.
Prohibition is the root of these gang killings, and despite the most vigorous efforts to stop them, they probably will continue as long as the Volstead Act is a law. Take away the incentive by legalizing the sale of wholesale beer, and you eliminate the bootlegger.
Moran and Capone also wanted to eliminate a bootlegger. They just wanted it to be each other. When the police had time to examine the scene and talk to witnesses near SMC Cartage Company, they came to the conclusion that the 3 men dressed as police officers were fake, and that the 2 men in plain clothes the fake officers took away from the scene were also part of the gang that did the killing. That conclusion was not without controversy. Some believe that since the police did have connections with the gangs, maybe they had in fact been the shooters. The investigation focused on what happened once the men dressed as police, whoever they were, got inside the garage. They deduced that the members of the North Side gang weren't likely to be concerned by the officers' presence.
At this point, if you're involved in bootlegging, you're kind of used to raids from the police. You're used to having to pay them off. And so if the police arrive, the best thing to do is just to comply, get it over with, pay whatever you have to pay to get off the hook and move on with your life. And so most likely the officers come in, order the 7 men to line up against the wall so they can frisk them for any firearms. But then instead of arresting them and taking them downtown or trying to negotiate a bribe or something like that, the 7 men probably began to realize that something's off. This not quite the same. But by that point, it's too late for them. The people disguised as the police officers open fire. Plainclothes men at some point have entered the space. They most likely have guns as well. We know that submachine guns were used to kill the 7 men. We know that shotguns were used to kill the 7 men. It probably unfolded in just a minute or two, and then it was over.
Investigators determined that each man had been shot in 3 places: the head, chest, and stomach. 5 of the victims were quickly identified as gang members.
You had these figures that had important roles within the organization. So I think it is significant that they were all there at one point. And there's different reasons given as to why they were there. Some accounts believe that Moran himself had called the meeting because he wanted to meet with the upper level of his gang to kind of like think through how they could respond to the increasing threat posed by the Chicago outfit and Al Capone. Others feel that they were kind of lured there deliberately to like unload a shipment of illegal booze so that they could kind of set up this hit. We don't really know as to like why they were there specifically.
But the other two victims were not members of Moran's gang. One was a mechanic, John May.
He's actually there doing the work that you'd expect to be done at the SMC Cartage Company, which is like maintaining the fleet of trucks. He's the mechanic. It doesn't matter that they're being used to transport illegal booze. There's still like, trucks that need to be repaired and maintained, and he's doing that work. May had a criminal background. He'd been arrested a couple times for safe breaking and for burglary, but it seemed like he had tried to like reform his ways. And what the newspaper accounts continually emphasize with May, the mechanic, is that he was married and that he had 7 children. So like now the sort of provider for this family is dead.
The other outlier was Reinhard Schwimmer.
Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, we talk about him being an optometrist, but really he had inherited a business from his father, didn't manage it well, and was more or less supported by his mother at the time of his death, even though he was between the ages of 29 and 30 at the time that he died.
Schwimmer was apparently a fan of the North Side Gang and liked to hang out with the men. There's no evidence he ever did anything illegal. He was just a groupie.
I mean, who knows how they regarded him? They probably tolerated him, maybe thought of him as being something of like a mascot in some ways. I mean, probably they were flattered by the fact that someone found them to be impressive and interesting.
Schwimmer's death, along with the brutality of the killings, shocked the city and the country. For Police Commissioner William Russell, it was a turning point.
This outrage is the last straw. The gangsters have declared war openly and boldly, and the police department has accepted the challenge. I am issuing orders to arrest every gangster, hoodlum, and racketeer in the city.
The name, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was almost immediately given by the press to the events of the day. But was the choice of Valentine's Day an accident? Or was it on purpose? A nod to the fact that there was no love for Moran.
If Moran was the target, that raises certain questions. So it suggests that maybe the killers didn't know who Moran was, right? And then so they get into the garage and they see 7 people there. Weinschenk has this passing resemblance, but they're not absolutely certain. So it's easiest just to kill them all to make sure that they get their intended target because Moran is supposed to be in that garage.
Word is that Moran was on his way to the garage.
Different accounts suggest that Moran actually did like walk by the site, right? And in some accounts, he was delayed because he decided to get his hair cut. And then, he was on foot and it was icy. And so he took his time.
But other theories suggest that the killers did not miss their target.
The alternative is that Moran wasn't the target and that something else brought those killers to that garage that day. And who knows what that reason could be. It could have been simply to weaken the Moran gang. It could have been because of something some of the others involved had done. So there's some theories that the Gusenbergs had killed somebody and they were taking revenge on them. They were the actual intended target. But again, we don't really know. This is all just speculation.
When reporters asked Moran who killed the men in the garage, he had an answer.
You must be new to this town, mister. Only Al Capone kills like that.
But Al Capone was quite a distance from Clark Street. He was at his home in Miami. Not that it made him any less of a suspect.
You don't have to be physically present in Chicago to order a hit here. So it provides him with something of an alibi, but not a terribly strong one.
Capone allegedly offered his opinion on the identity of the killer.
The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran.
Capone was subpoenaed by a grand jury in Chicago. His lawyer sent word that he was suffering from pneumonia and was not well enough to travel. That was quickly disproven, and he was arrested for contempt of court.
Capone is eventually brought back to Chicago to give some testimony because many, many people believe that it was he who sort of ordered this hit, but there's no evidence, right, to actually support that.
He posted bond and traveled to Philadelphia, where he was quickly arrested on charges of carrying a concealed weapon. He served 9 months.
And there are those who think that this was all intentional, like him getting apprehended, letting himself get arrested and convicted so that he could basically kind of remove himself for a time being until attention toward the massacre dissipated. But again, that's just like a lot of speculation.
Moran went into hiding, checking into a hospital under an assumed name, while a sort of investigation continued.
Just as there's a lot of mystery around the crime itself, there's a lot of questions as to like how the investigation unfolded. So like different people kind of claim jurisdiction over it. So you've got the local Chicago police there. You've got the state's attorney, John Swanson, who decides that this should be kind of taken over by the state's attorney's office. You've got the coroner, Herman Bundesen, who kind of moves in, starts to do his own investigation, and kind of impanels a grand jury. And they're not exactly working in a coordinated way. So, a day after the incident on February 15th, Bundesen, he takes the jury back to the cartage company on Clark Street and actually has the massacre itself restaged so they could see what they could learn from reenacting it to the best of their knowledge. But these competing attempts to sort of unravel what occurred, as I mentioned, aren't coordinated. They don't really lead to anything. And very quickly, the sort of investigation dries up.
One thing they hoped could yield answers was ballistics. Though the use of ballistics in criminal cases had been around for nearly a century, it entered a new chapter in the 1920s, led by scientist Calvin Goddard.
Calvin Goddard is supported by certain civic leaders in setting up one of the first forensic labs at Northwestern University. And so he does an analysis of the casings that are recovered from the massacre site.
Because the police were potential suspects, the lab was completely independent from the Chicago Police Department.
He's able to determine that while machine guns were used in the commission of the crime, they weren't the kind of machine guns that were used by the Chicago Police Department. So, there were even some thoughts that perhaps the police really were involved and that these weren't fake cops early on, but he's able to quickly disprove that. He also is able to analyze the shotgun shells as well. Some of this forensic data will later be used when different figures are apprehended to try to tie firearms that are recovered to the crime.
Approximately 70 rounds of ammunition had been fired into the men and the brick wall behind them. But without the guns to compare them to, there was little for Goddard to do. There were rumors. Small-time hoods were pointing fingers at each other, even taking credit. But there was nothing of substance. A week after the shootings, the car likely used in the killings was found 3 miles away, partially burned and dismantled. But it was only an assumption that it was the car, based on the description of witnesses. There was no evidence left behind. There was very little else for police until December, when weapons and ammunition were found at the home of Fred Burke in St. Joseph, Michigan. Burke, nicknamed Killer, had ties to the Capone gang. Calvin Goddard test-fired several weapons. He compared the bullets and casings to the one from the massacre. They matched perfectly, which does lend itself to the theory that Capone was somehow involved.
There is a lasting legacy of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It is the sort of advancements that occurred in the field of forensic science, the establishment of this lab at Northwestern, and the bringing of Calvin Goddard to the Chicago area, because he and the lab will remain kind of important in the years ahead and in subsequent criminal investigations.
Police named Burke as their primary suspect, though they didn't indict. Despite Goddard's evidence, they felt there wasn't enough to convict. And then they looked at another suspect, Jack McGurn. Machine Gun McGurn was a mobster who also had ties to Capone. He was a suspect in the 1926 death of Capone's rival gang leader, Jaime Weiss. He was also part owner of the Green Mill, which was a speakeasy in the 1920s. He was arrested, but his girlfriend Louise Rolfe said McGurn was with her on Valentine's Day. She was quickly nicknamed the Blonde Alibi.
Individuals are arrested in connection with the crimes, but there's never any evidence to actually proceed beyond arresting them. So cases are never brought to trial, and certainly no one is prosecuted for it.
Though things pointed to Capone, there wasn't solid evidence against him. And Al Capone knew it.
They've hung everything on me but the Chicago fire.
We don't know who executed the crime definitively. We don't know the reason why. Everything is a speculation. And there's bits and pieces of evidence here and there to suggest that one version or another might be more valid. And so I think it's very important to emphasize from the start that there's still a lot of mystery around this.
The public quickly assigned responsibility for the massacre, Prohibition. But they also felt that the killings were a sign that gang wars had gone too far. The public would no longer turn a blind eye to Al Capone, and neither would President Herbert Hoover. He's alleged to have repeatedly asked his cabinet, how do we get Capone? And that likely led to federal involvement in Chicago and to Eliot Ness. Ness's team eventually cost Capone an estimated $9 million in lost revenue because of their raids. That's $170 million now.
After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Al Capone continues to run the Chicago office, but in the midst of the Great Depression, the repeal movement really kind of like picks up steam, and it seems like it'll be inevitable at some point.
By 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sent to prison. His nemesis, Bugs Moran, did not fare better.
Moran never fully recovers from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. He vows revenge against Capone, who he believes is responsible for it. He continues to run the Northside outfit. But, once repeal goes into effect, with fear in April of 33 and then everything else in December of 1933, it really cuts off a good source of Moran's income. And he kind of reverts back very quickly to his old ways, where he's more or less just engaged in theft and burglary, robs a couple of banks in rural communities across Ohio, gets arrested multiple times, ends up succumbing to cancer while in federal prison, and dies in 1957.
Al Capone didn't die in prison, but his ending was equally bleak.
He's a broken man. While he's incarcerated, his health really begins to deteriorate. He's diagnosed with tertiary syphilis. And so when he's released, he's not really in a state where he can kind of resume his criminal operations. So instead, he retires to Florida, where he continues to decline, but manages to live until 1947, when he eventually dies of pneumonia.
The final victim of the attack was Highball, who had been found by police in the garage, chained up and trembling. He had been the mechanic, John May's dog. Some reports say that he was adopted, but most agree that the dog, traumatized by the events of the day, had been put down by the police. Chicago and the world was left with a lot of unanswered questions. Who was the target? And was the point to kill Moran or merely to kill his influence? And most importantly, who did it? Though he was never arrested for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, many assume Capone was behind it. We don't know. We do know that the massacre contributed to the end of Prohibition by highlighting that this experiment in making America dry had actually led to an increase in violence and criminal behavior.
There's a good chance we wouldn't know if any of these individuals if Prohibition hadn't gone into effect. Prohibition is really what sort of gave them the opportunity to make vast amounts of wealth, to create a kind of criminal operation that extended beyond Prohibition's repeal, and also to kind of enter into the American imagination as these kind of folk figures.
Whatever his involvement, the events of February 14, 1929 did help make Al Capone a legend.
Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. I'm kind to everyone. But when someone is unkind to me, weak is not what you're going to remember about me.
What do you think about this case? Please comment below. And if you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like and notification buttons, and let us know if there are cases you'd like us to cover.